All right, this is part two of chapter 25. I had a technical difficulty. Here we go.
Now, key to this kind of city life is the rise of political bosses and machine politics. And these are very tightly organized groups, and political machines control the politics in the major cities. And the most famous example is William Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall in New York. And the process of these political machines was really simple. The political bosses controlled the rank and file of the party and rewarded supporters with jobs. If you vote for the political boss, for the political machine, if you are loyal politically, they're going to hook you up with positions within the government. In fact, what you see happening is one of the reasons why these political machines are so effective is because they provide basic welfare type services, which were not offered by the government at the time to the poor and immigrant communities.
All right, real quick. Political machines are in major cities throughout the United States during that time period. And there, like today, we look at our national election for the president or whatever. We look at major political figures on a national level as being the most important political institutions and being the most powerful political entities in the country today. Well, back then, really, yeah, president was important and congressman was important, so on and so forth. But in general, the most important and most powerful political beings were in these political machines in these big cities where you had, party bosses that pretty much controlled all the politics of a city. And they controlled, they helped people get jobs who supported them, so on and so forth. And then one of the things that they did for immigrants is they would help to provide them with basic welfare services, schooling, housing, things of that nature. And they're doing this so that they can get votes. But these political bosses and political machines were very powerful in these cities, and they often became very corrupt. The most famous political boss was William Boss Tweed, who was the boss of Tammany Hall in New York. So when you hear political boss, you should think of that guy's name. And again, really powerful and very corrupt more often than not.
Now, this comes at great expense. In fact, you have large-scale greed, graft, corruption, and fraud was extremely common. And we saw previously that Thomas Nast exposes that greed, especially with regard to Tammany Hall with his political cartoons. Now, a key component of this time period is not only urbanization, but immigration. And it's important you keep in mind that there is a different type of immigrant, and people made certain generalizations about these so-called new immigrants.
All right, pay attention to old immigrants versus new immigrants, the generalizations that were being made about those people. Pay attention to where they're from. Old immigrants, England, Ireland, Germany. New immigrants, Italy, Russia, Poland, Greece. So these new immigrants are coming from mostly Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, whereas these were coming from Northern and Western Europe.
The old immigrants were from largely Northern and Western European countries. England, Ireland, and Germany, we saw through much of the early 19th century. These new immigrants are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and we're talking places like Italy, Russia, Poland, and Greece. And there's a perception that these new immigrants were different. And in some ways they were. The old immigrants tended to be Protestant. However, remember with the Irish, there were a number of Catholics who came over. But with these new immigrants, you have the majority are not Protestant. In fact, you get a huge number of Catholics, Greek Orthodox, and Jews coming over. Another thing was the old immigrants tended to be literate and skilled. They could read and write in their own language, and many, in fact, if they were from England or Ireland, spoke English, whereas these new immigrants were largely illiterate and unskilled. There was this perception that the old immigrants were quick to assimilate, whereas these new immigrants were reluctant to assimilate. They were very clannish, was the perception, and they stuck to themselves. The old immigrants came from countries where there was a tradition of democracy or democratic principles, where there was, once again, this perception, in some ways, a reality that these new immigrants were coming from areas with a history of radical ideas like communism, anarchism, or socialism. And the old immigrants, especially the Germans and the British, tended to come over, and they were not completely poor. Many of them were middle class, whereas these new immigrants arrived largely poor.
You need to know this chart. So if I were you, I would jot this chart down, and I would know descriptions of old immigrants and descriptions of new immigrants.
And what you see is the reasons these people are coming, these so-called new immigrants, are the same reasons why all immigrants come, and you could be breaking it down into two categories.
All right, you're going to have push factors and pull factors. So pull factors are things that are drawing people to America. Push factors are things that are pushing these people out of their own countries, right? And you'll need to be familiar with both factors that are causing people to move, to immigrate to the United States.
Pull factors, America's ideals. You have political freedom, you have religious freedom, at least in principle or the ideal of it. There's stories from previous generations. You're hearing about this, mythic place, America. And key, really, though, in this time period is the jobs created by the Industrial Revolution. There was economic opportunity. And that's why you have this unprecedented large number of immigrants coming over during this period of the Gilded Age. Now, there are also pull factors, and this is key when you're talking about why are so many Southern and Eastern European immigrants coming. Well,
he meant to say push factors.
Well, for one, in Europe, farm jobs were being lost to mechanization, which means there's a lack of land. And so if you lost your land, you're going to look for a new start, because poverty and extremely difficult lives was the norm in much of Southern and Eastern Europe. There's also political instability in many of these places, especially Russia. There's a lack of political freedom and religious persecution. In fact, you have something called pogroms taking place, violence against Jews in Russia and in other parts of Eastern Europe. So you have this huge influx of people from a different region of Europe, and as a result, you get a response to the changing immigration patterns. One thing to keep in mind is many of the immigrants who came over were processed starting in 1892 through Ellis Island, an immigrant processing station in New York Harbor. And just like the old immigrants, remember, especially the Irish and the Germans, we had the Know-Nothing Party. You have a rise of nativism.
All right, remember that term. You've got to be familiar with the term nativism. Also know that Ellis Island was the island where most people arrived on the East Coast. Angel Island was an island where most people arrived on the West Coast.
Except, unlike with the Irish and the Germans, this one is going to be much more intense. And there's a couple of reasons. One is racial motivations. These new immigrants were seen as racially inferior. They're not Anglo-Saxon. There's economic reasons. There's this feeling that they took jobs, immigrants took jobs and lowered wages. In fact, many labor unions oftentimes oppose these immigrants coming in and will not allow immigrants to join the union. There's political reasons for nativism. There's this belief, there's this perception that they're coming over with these very radical ideas. And there's religious. They're not Protestant, which, although we are technically a country with freedom of religion, many people at this time are viewing America as a Protestant nation. And as a result, you are going to have attempts at exclusion. In fact, you're going to see policies of discrimination being pursued. We've already seen this with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese immigrants were not under the category of new immigrants, that is Southern and Eastern European immigrants, but you are going to see groups like the American Protective Association, which was an anti-Catholic group made up of American Protestants, and they really wanted to keep Catholic immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe out of America. You also have, throughout the decades, literacy tests being proposed. They are vetoed by various presidents, but in 1917, they are passed. And this was intended to keep the undesirable, the uneducated immigrants, once again, largely from Southern and Eastern Europe, out of America. And an important period of time that we're going to learn about in another video is in the 1920s. You're going to see the passage of quota acts, which will severely restrict immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Pay attention to this particular image. This is the response to the changing immigration that was taking place. So pay attention to why nativism was important, all of those four categories: racial, economic, political, and religious reasons why people were becoming more nativist, and then pay attention to what they tried to get done in society to reflect their views, their nativist views.
Another thing you should keep in mind is the various attempts undertaken to deal with the problems posed by urbanization and immigration. And really, one of those is the social gospel movement. And key to that movement is this guy, Walter, that guy. And the basic principle of the social gospel movement was that Christians had a responsibility to deal with urban poverty. And as Christians, you must work to help those in need. There's also the Salvation Army, which comes over from England in 1879, and their basic idea is providing poverty relief while spreading Christian values. You also see that with the Young Man's Christian Association, the YMCA and the YWCA, also promoting Christian values. And you see this very often. These reform movements are focusing on moral improvement of the poor or immigrants, Americanization in these attempts to help those in need. Unique is the settlement house movement because they are unique in the sense that they live amongst the poor and in immigrant communities. And Jane Addams is the key figure in this movement in the U.S. when she establishes Hull House in Chicago in 1889. And this provides various social services in the community, and it helps immigrants adapt to the new society. They have language classes, English classes that people could participate in, childhood education, and other services directly in the community.
All right, real quick, what I want you to know here is that these are responses to urbanization and immigration that are not being done by the government. These are being done by private people, by just regular people or businesses, community leaders. These are things that are being created in the private sector, by just non-government people. Social gospel movement was really pushed by Carnegie. The Salvation Army, that's obvious what that has nothing to do with government. Settlement houses, YMCA and YWCA. And then these settlement houses run by Jane Addams, who basically had these houses where they would help people who needed help, especially women and immigrants. They would let them stay there, and they would provide them with education. They would help to give them job training and things of that nature. And all this is being done not through government.
And they are secular based, whereas many of the others were Christian in their reform approach. Another key idea to keep in mind is that there were individuals who challenged and supported the social order of the Gilded Age. And if you recall from the colonial period, there was this belief in the Protestant work ethic, where if you work hard, you were being a good Christian, and that was the path to godliness. And you see during the Industrial Revolution the popularity of people like Horatio Alger, who wrote dime novels such as Ragged Dick and Struggling Upward. And it's the story of rags to riches. Honesty, hard work leads to success. People coming from the bottom, now we hear. And this idea of the American dream, if you want to call it that, was reinforced by experiences of people such as Andrew Carnegie, who comes over from Scotland as an immigrant and becomes one of the most wealthy men in the world. Now, the reality is there were many, many more examples of people not going from rags to riches. And what you see during this time period are a growing number of critics of the industrial pro-business climate of the Gilded Age. Remember, we had those people who talked about the gospel of wealth that justified their success at the top, and social Darwinists and others. But you get these whole groups of thinkers such as Henry George, who wrote Progress and Poverty. And what he does is he critically examined the inequalities in wealth caused by industrialization and laissez-faire capitalism. And you have others such as Edward Bellamy, who wrote a utopian novel called Looking Backward, about a utopian socialist society that has fixed the social and economic injustices of the time by adopting socialist principles. And what you see over and over again is people struggling to make sense of this new world of wealth and poverty and everything in between. Eventually, you're going to get effort to reform these problems will eventually lead to a movement known as the progressive movement in the 1890s. We're going to cover that in another video. But key to the progressive movement is during this period, you have a rise of the press. Newspaper printing becomes much more affordable. There's a huge increase in education. Remember, a throwback here for a moment, Horace Mann in Massachusetts during the Age of Reform in the 1830s, 1840s. But you have increasingly in the late 19th century, compulsory attendance in school, high school, all the way down to kindergarten. Tax supported schools were becoming more accessible, not just in northern cities, and illiteracy rates were dropping more and more.
All right, real quick. So, belief systems of the Industrial Revolution, belief in the Protestant work ethic, that's what would get you ahead in society. That's really a pretty foundational point for American history and really even for today. Uh, a strong work ethic will get you, it will help you to succeed in society. If you don't have a good, strong work ethic, you're likely to be unsuccessful. I mean, that's not something I think that's really all that debatable. Granted, some people have more talent, some have more drive, some have different things that motivate them. But in the end, if you work really hard at certain things, you can become successful in doing those things. Horatio Alger, story of rags to riches, honesty, hard work would lead to success. This was reinforced by the experience of people such as Andrew Carnegie. So he was a pro industrial revolution guy, a pro grow the economy, self responsibility. You make your own way in this world kind of person. Then you had critics of the industrial pro-business climate of the Gilded Age. Keep in mind, they keep talking about laissez-faire capitalism, but if the government is pro-business and they are passing laws that benefit one business over another, or they're bailing out businesses from going bankrupt, that is socialism. That is not laissez-faire capitalism. That is, government is actively involved in making sure that this business or this industry is successful. There's nothing capitalist about that. That is government favors. Capitalist would be, I have a business or I'm in an industry, we're providing goods and services that people want and need, and we are making a lot of money because people pay for those goods and services, and they are happy with what we are giving them. And everybody walks away from those transactions happy. That is laissez-faire capitalism. So then you get to reform movements to try to remedy some of these issues, and that will lead to the progressive movement of the 1890s. You'll see the press become much more of a visible presence in society. Education will become important as you see some of the issues with education as we move into the 1900s.
Finally, African Americans are going to have their own unique experiences and approaches to this era they find themselves in. And one of the key figures you should know about is Booker T. Washington. He's from the South. He's an ex-slave. He writes an autobiography called Up from Slavery. And what he talks about is the need for African Americans to acquire vocational skills, job skills, in order to gain self-respect and economic security. He's going to create a institute called the Tuskegee Institute, which is going to help African Americans achieve these goals of vocational education. And he does not advocate for directly challenging white supremacy. And some people are going to accuse him of being an accommodationist because of his gradual approach, this so-called accepting racism and just focusing on self-help.
All right, real quick, Booker T. Washington. Then you have also W.E.B. Du Bois is another one. I think he's about to talk about him for a minute. But essentially, Booker T. Washington said, look, we've got to, as a people, we've got to focus on ourselves as individuals. And we need to become successful in the economy. And through uh, economic success, we will acquire then political success. And we will acquire new rights. We've got to become more powerful in the economy, economically, being able to take care of our own individual lives.
But for Booker T. Washington, economic independence would be the ticket to black political and civil rights. And so, therefore, that was key to his vision. On the opposite end was W.E.B. Du Bois, and he is from the North, from Massachusetts. He is the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard, so a smart dude. And he helps create the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909, the NAACP. And he is different from Booker T in that he demanded immediate political and social equality for black people, that African Americans should become intellectuals and resist prejudice and racism wherever they could. And he rejects Booker T's gradualism, and he is going to be a critic of Booker T, and they're both going to offer very unique visions for African American liberation.
All right. So he says, look, the way for African Americans to get out of this, being pretty much a secondary type citizen, if that, is that we've got to win political rights. We've got to get social equality, and it's got to be something on a national scale or a wide scale, as opposed to Booker T, who said, focus on yourself, become successful, and be able to take care of yourself economically, and then we can acquire those rights, and we can acquire that equality that we've been searching for. W.E.B. Du Bois says we've got to come together on a massive scale and demand our political and social rights.
And for W.E.B. Du Bois, he really advocated in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, the talented 10th in the black community should become the intellectuals to lead African Americans towards greater civil rights. Finally, we're done.
All right, that's it. Make sure that you're keeping up with your assignments. Make sure that you email me if you have any issues. And hopefully we will see you on Thursday.